Okay, folks, hope everybody's doing well. Here we are for the lecture on an introduction to epistemology. We're going to look at a couple of different arguments here for skepticism, right? And so the title of this one is Dreams, Simulation, Skepticism, and Skepticism in Rick and Morty. So the theme of being deceived about what reality is, or whether we are living in reality or a simulation, and knowing what reality is a central theme that pops up a lot in Rick and Morty. So, for example, in Lawnmower Dog episode from season 1, they the B plot of that episode involves Rick and Morty and is like a parody of the movie Inception, where we don't know whether we're in the real world or a dream world, right? In M. Night Shyamalan's, some aliens attempt to deceive Rick and trick Rick and manipulate him by simulating reality and trying to trick him into thinking that he's in a reality, so he'll give up some information to them. In Total Recall, an episode from, I think this is season 2, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it's the Total Recall episode. It also raises this issue of skepticism and the question about how we can really know something is the case or not the case by positing fake memories of people, right, that are actually put into our heads by brain parasites in order to trick us. So this idea of deception, manipulation with regard to knowledge pops up again and again in Rick and Morty. And in the episode Total Recall, the question is, you get these little rational sentient beings or conscious beings that are living in a creation, a simulation of reality, and then a simulation within a simulation. So that episode really ramps down this idea of skepticism. So you see that again in several different episodes of Rick and Morty. Rick, from time to time, even wonders about whether Morty is a simulation or not. So it's a pretty central theme in many episodes. Another way in which it's raised, the issue of skepticism is raised, skepticism about reality is raised, is, do we live in a single universe or is there a multiverse, right? Which kind of elucidates this idea of simulations, multiple realities. So, like I said, in the last lecture on personal identity, that was an issue of a metaphysical issue. So metaphysics deals with the nature of reality. Epistemology deals with how we know, or what is knowledge, right? That's the basic question of epistemology. So it's the area of philosophy that studies the nature and foundations and sources and limits of knowledge. And of course, we're always worried about knowledge of something. And so here the issue is knowledge of reality. How do we know what the difference between what's the appearances and what's real, right? And so epistemology and metaphysics kind of go hand in hand in philosophy. But you just need to know that here that the primary issue is not what's the nature of reality, but is what's the nature of knowledge. And here we're worried about what's the nature of knowledge about what's real, and more precisely, whether we can know it all, what's real or not. So some central questions in this area of philosophy are: what is the nature of knowledge? What distinguishes knowledge from mere opinion or mere belief, right? What justifies a belief? What's the nature of truth? And is knowledge even possible? And it's that last skeptical question that we'll be focused on primarily in this lecture. So the challenge of skepticism about the external world, or more radically, the challenge of skepticism that denies the possibility of knowledge. That's really how we're going to treat the issue here for our purposes. And so a way of getting started with this issue is to consider a thought experiment. In the last lecture, we talked about a couple of different thought experiments, one from Locke and a couple from Parfit. And here we have another thought experiment. And again, thought experiments can be used in different ways in philosophy. Sometimes it's just to kind of get us to focus on how we would address a fundamental issue. And here is kind of how that in this thought experiment with George and Omar, we kind of had that at hand. Another way we might use thought experiments, like in moral philosophy, is if we, posit one hypothetical, we identify one way of acting there, or one principle that would guide our actions there, and then we contrast with how we might respond to a similar but slightly different thought experiment to look for logical consistency or something like that. So again, thought experiments might be used in different ways. Sometimes they're just used to help us try to think about what are our basic foundational intuitions about a case, right? So here we have George and Omar. So I'll read through this here. So George and Omar are roommates and enjoy having late night philosophical discussions. One such night, Omar argues at some point in time, by like the year 2300, the medical and computer sciences will be able to simulate the real world very convincingly. They'll be able to grow a brain without a body and hook it up to a supercomputer in just the right way so that the brain has experiences exactly as if it were a real person walking around the real world, talking to other people and so on. And so the brain would believe it was a real person walking around the real world, etc., except that it would be wrong. It's just stuck in a virtual world with no actual legs to walk and with no other actual people to talk to. And here's the thing, how could you ever tell, in other words, how could you ever know that it isn't the real 2300 now, and that you're not really a virtual reality brain? In other words, a brain being fed experiences of what reality outside your own head is like. So like being stuck in the matrix, right? So if you were a virtual reality brain, after all, everything would look and feel exactly the same to you as it does now. George thinks for a minute and replies, but look, here are my legs. He points down to his legs. If I were a virtual reality brain, I wouldn't have any legs, really. I'd only be just a disembodied brain. But I know I have legs, just look at them. So I must be a real person and not a virtual reality brain, because only real people have legs. So I'll continue to believe that I'm not a virtual reality brain. George and Omar are actually real humans in the actual world today, so neither of them are virtual reality brains, which means George's belief is true. So two questions to consider here. One, does George really know that he's not a virtual reality brain, or does he only believe it? So notice that responding to that question requires us to have some kind of distinction between mere belief versus knowledge, right? The idea being, even in common sense language, that belief is one thing and knowledge is more than just belief, right? And then the second question is, does pointing to his legs prove that George is not a virtual reality, in a virtual world, or a virtual reality brain? In other words, that he's in the real world. Explain why or why not. And we can forgive George here for his oversight that amputees seem to not be real people in his view. That doesn't really seem to be his point. He's thinking that the idea that if he were a virtual reality brain, he wouldn't have any legs to point to, right? And so the question again is, does pointing to his legs really prove that George is not in a virtual world? Why or why not? So pause the video here and think about how you would answer those two questions. And as I've mentioned before, when we're doing these thought experiments, you need to make sure that your response directly addresses the question as asked, right? Or questions that are asked, and that it takes into account and works from any of the working assumptions of the thought experiment. So for example, if we had a thought experiment that involved time travel and you gave a response that said, well, time travel, we don't have the ability to engage in time travel. So, here's the answer here's my response to the thought experiment. I wouldn't count that as a very good response, right? It's a way of avoiding the questions that we're trying to get you to think about rather than addressing them, right? So make sure that, again, that you do respond to the question that's asked, and that your response takes into account any of the working assumptions of the thought experiment. So in this case, the working assumption is that in the year 2300, the medical sciences would be so advanced that they could do this sort of thing, for example, right? So again, just pause the video here and try and give your responses to those two questions. And again, you need to think about them thoroughly enough so that you can begin thinking about what the difference between belief and knowledge is, at least in your view, and then whether or not pointing to his legs would really prove George's point or not, and why or why not it would. All right, so pause here and think about those two questions for a little bit. And then after you've got your answers, go ahead and consider responding with your responses or giving your responses in the discussion forum so that we can talk about them, or think about how you might ask a question about them, or how you might offer those up for discussion in the live session. So again, pause here to give you a few minutes to consider those two questions, and then we'll start back up. Okay, so hopefully you thought about those for a minute or two, or really longer, I hope. Let's dig into the issue a little bit more here. So keep your responses in mind, because we're going to come back to some key ideas here that will relate back to that George and Omar thought experiment. So here's the challenge of skepticism. You do not know that you are not a brain suspended in a vat full of liquid in a laboratory wired to a computer, which is feeding you your current experiences under the control of some ingenious technician scientist. How do we know, in other words, that we're not in one of Rick's batteries generating power for him? So for if you were such a brain, then provided that the scientist is successful, nothing in your experience could possibly reveal to you that you were. For your experience is ex hypothesis, in other words, from the hypothesis under consideration, identical with that of something which is not a brain in a vat. So in other words, if you're a brain in a vat, you'd have a kind of experience that would be exactly the same as the experience of an individual that's not a brain in a vat, that's in the real world. So since you only have your own experience to appeal to, and that experience is the same in either situation, nothing can reveal to you which situation is the actual one. So consider that second question that I had you think about with regard to George and Omar. If George was in a virtual world, he would be perceiving virtual legs. So it doesn't look like pointing to something in his experience is good enough to show whether his experiences and experiences of the real world or a virtual world, right? So this is the skeptical challenge. It's a challenge that's raising the idea, or that's positing the idea that we can't really know whether we're in a simulation or a dream or in the real world, right? So when we talk about knowledge, when philosophers talk about knowledge, they typically have propositional knowledge in mind. These other types of knowledge that I list here, familiarity or technical knowledge, know-how, how to repair a car, or how to put together a computer so that it works, or the familiarity that you have about how your friend's personality from your interactions with them, or how your pet behaves because of your interactions and familiarity or acquaintance with that other animal. I mean, it looks like propositional knowledge is foundational to those sorts of things. So for example, if you want to know how to erect a house, how to construct a house, you got to have some propositional knowledge about angles, load-bearing surfaces, this sorts of thing, right? So propositional knowledge is the focus of epistemology. That's what epistemology is really focused on here. What counts as propositional knowledge. So that's why I have an asterisk here by it, since it's the one that's foundational for us and the focus of epistemology. And sometimes philosophers talk about that. The shorthand they use for talking about propositional knowledge, or the standard account of knowledge as it's sometimes called, is knowing that something is the case, right? So, and I'm going to introduce a further distinction there. We need to consider a priori knowledge, right, as well as a posteriori knowledge, both of which could count as, or candidates for different types of propositional knowledge, right? So a priori knowledge is knowledge that's independent of sense experience of the world. So knowledge that's rooted in maybe what we might call pure reason, right? Abstract reason maybe. As opposed to a posteriori knowledge, and that's knowledge from sense experience, or that's dependent upon sense experience of the world, right? So the natural sciences are a form of a posteriori knowledge, or the results of our scientific inquiries, when they're confirmed, we count as a priori, or excuse me, not a priori knowledge, a posteriori knowledge. So natural sciences, questions like whether it's raining outside right now or not, we know that through observation of the world, right? As opposed to things like the knowledge of the law of non-contradiction, or mathematical knowledge, that the idea that 2 + 2 equals 4, no matter what else is going on in the world, not what the contingent facts of the world are. So that would be maybe an example of mathematical knowledge. Pure mathematical knowledge would be an example of what philosophers might think of as a priori knowledge. In other words, knowledge that is based in pure reason, but that is not dependent upon observations of the world. So a priori knowledge would count as universal and necessary, whereas a posteriori knowledge, those are not they're knowledge claims, right? But they're contingent in particular. So they are the case, but they might not be the case. So for example, the claim that Chris Blakely is bald is a contingent in particular truth. It's worried about a particular being, Chris Blakely, at a particular point in time now, right? As opposed to me when I was 19 and had, if you can believe it, long hair, right? So a contingent thing, right, in particular. So again, we're worried about propositional knowledge, and what we're really worried about here, what are the criteria for genuine propositional knowledge as opposed to mere belief? So here's what we might call, or do call in philosophy, the standard account of knowledge, or the standard account of propositional knowledge, or a justified true belief. And it has 3 criteria here. So we got a list of 3 criteria that have to be met in order for us to distinguish knowledge from belief, from mere belief. And then we're going to have a debate to worry about with required to the 3rd criteria, how much justification is required in order for something to count as knowledge. So the first criteria is that we got to have some subject, some agent. I'm just going to refer to that as S, right? Some subject. S stands for any potential knower or some agent, right? Some subject believes a proposition, and let P stand for the proposition. So the second criteria then is that P is true, and the 3rd criteria is that S, the agent, right, or subject, is justified in believing P. So the idea here then is that in order for something to count as genuine knowledge, we got to have an account of how we arrived at it, right? Some justification for it. In other words, some reason, some justification, some evidence that is said to justify believing P, and not just believing P, but that justifies the truth of P, right? So again, we're looking for person-independent justifications, evidence, and reason here that are open to public scrutiny, right? By any, in principle at least, any potential knower, right, or believer, or just some subject, right? So by belief, I mean the mental acceptance of a proposition is true, and by justification, I mean a reason or evidence that's said to support believing the proposition that we're worried about, whether it counts as a belief or genuine knowledge. And then the question that arises is with regard to criteria 3, how much justification is required, right, in order to be genuinely justified? And a common intuition that people have about justification, and we'll want to test this justification, that's part of what we'll be up to in this chapter, considering whether our initial intuition about justification should hold, or whether we should revise it in some way. A common intuition that people have about justification is that it requires certainty. In other words, the impossibility of being wrong. So by certainty, I don't just mean my subjective commitment to a belief. I mean epistemic certainty, the impossibility that the belief could be wrong, right? So again, I'm not worried about here. Knowledge seems to involve, genuine knowledge seems to involve something more than just me believing it, right? So we wouldn't say that mere belief justifies a belief, right? Such that if I just really believe with a lot of conviction and a lot of mental effort that I have a full head of hair, that wouldn't make it true that I have a full head of hair, right? Or that if I just really believe that squares and circles are the same thing, right? That seems insufficient for showing that a square is actually the same as a circle, or that just believing that I have a full head of hair is sufficient for showing that it's true that I have a full head of hair, right? So again, the idea here that our working assumption with regard to justification is that certainty is required, right? The impossibility of being wrong. So notice that I would want to, so let me raise a question about that, right? As an initial thing to start worrying about. I want to say that I know that there are cars on I-10 right now that run the highway, the main highway that runs through Baton Rouge and much of the southern United States. So sorry if there's some background noise right now. My mailman is shoving stuff through the mail slot over here behind me. So I would want to say that I know that there are cars on I-10 right now, but if certainty is required for justification, if it's, I'm only justified in believing P if I'm certain about the evidence, then I can't be certain about what's on I-10 right now. It's at least logically possible that there are no cars on I-10 right now. And since I'm not there observing I-10 right now, it's impossible to meet that certainty requirement. So it looks like I'm not justified in believing or claiming to know that there are cars on I-10 right now because I don't have all the total evidence that's available. Right? Pretty high standard for knowledge. Then notice that that seems to then generate a skeptical challenge. If certainty is required for justification, complete and total justification, in other words, the impossibility of being wrong, certainty, that it looks like I don't know much at all, right? It looks like I don't know maybe anything. That's the skeptical challenge, right? So here's the problem. Because any claim to knowledge will seemingly be susceptible to some doubt or error, it's always possible that we are mistaken about our beliefs. But if knowledge requires the kind of certainty that rules out the possibility of believing falsely, it seems to follow that we do not possess knowledge. So it looks like we're forced into a contradiction. Remember, philosophy is about attempting to discern and remove contradictions. Well, here's a contradiction that we've just discerned. On the one hand, I want to claim to know some stuff, at least some things, right? On the other hand, if knowledge requires certainty, the impossibility of being wrong, then it looks like we don't possess knowledge. Us altogether or me individually, anybody would possess knowledge. So we got a contradiction here. So now what we'll do is we'll consider some arguments for skepticism, 2 arguments for skepticism. And when we talk about skepticism here, we need to distinguish a couple of different senses of skepticism so we're clear about what the problem is. So as I mentioned here in on the slide, there are different senses of skepticism. On the one hand, what we're worried about is the denial of the possibility of knowledge. So complete epistemological skepticism, radical skepticism, or global skepticism, it's the denial of the possibility of knowledge, right? That might be global. So a radical skepticism or complete skepticism, the denial of any possible knowledge whatsoever, or that might be the denial of knowledge in a particular domain. So for example, in the logic section, I gave an argument that said, well, look, you can't have philosophical knowledge. You might have scientific knowledge, but not philosophical knowledge. Philosophy just all comes down to belief, right? We looked at an argument for that and a criticism of it as well. So, on the one hand, I might think that, look, when it comes to scientific claims, we can have genuine knowledge and we can refute stuff. But when it comes to like religion or supernatural claims, that's all just a matter of belief. You don't get genuine knowledge there, right? So that would be a kind of the denial of possibility of knowledge, but just restricted to a particular area of inquiry. That is opposed to both of those senses of skepticism that involve the denial of the possibility of knowledge, either altogether, global skepticism, or in a particular area, right? We can contrast both of those that deny the possibility of knowledge with ordinary incredulity or doubt, right? Nothing particularly philosophically problematic about ordinary incredulity or doubt. In fact, that's a good thing, right, in many ways, right? That's where we begin thinking critically about things, is with ordinary incredulity. I come to you and say that I was abducted by aliens last night, and you understandably exercise some doubt about the truth of that claim, the claim that I was abducted by aliens last night, and you're going to want to have some evidence for it, right, before you accept it. So by skepticism in this lecture and with regard to epistemology here, I don't simply mean doubting, I mean the denial of the possibility of knowledge. And we're going to worry again about global skepticism, arguments for global skepticism here. At least that's how we'll treat them initially here. So a philosopher, a very influential philosopher that was worried about this problem is Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes is often talked about as the father of modern philosophy. He was very impressed with the kind of certainty that the sciences seem to admit and that modern mathematics seem to give us, and wanted to apply that kind of deductive method to other claims, philosophical claims, to see what we could have genuine knowledge of. So what Descartes did is that he engaged in methodological doubt. He said, I'm going to doubt everything that I can logically doubt in order to try and find something that can't be doubted, and then whatever that claim is that can't be doubted, rationally doubted, right, will serve as the foundation for an entire theory of knowledge. So if I can, his idea here is that I'm going to doubt everything that's logically possible, try to find something that is indubitable, that can't be doubted, that's clear and distinct. That's his language, right? That we can know clearly and distinctly. And then once we identify that proposition, then we can see what other propositions are entailed by that foundational proposition and build up a whole body of knowledge from there, right? And so long as we deduce things from that foundational claim correctly, the other things can be known with certainty as well, right? Through inference. So as a part of performing his methodological doubt, Descartes doubts many, many things, right? And engages and takes up and considers a couple of different arguments for skepticism, right? So Descartes himself, at the end of the day, is not a skeptic or a radical skeptic. He engaged in methodological doubt as a way of trying to find something that was indubitable, and he thinks that he can find something like that, right? So he's setting up these arguments that he thinks he has to engage in order to find that one proposition that is indubitable. So as a part of engaging in methodological doubt, Descartes doubts the difference between waking states and dreaming states. So let's call this the dream argument for skepticism. So he says, I certainly look upon this paper with eyes wide awake. The head which I now move is not asleep. I extend this hand consciously with express purpose, and I perceive it, and occurrences in sleep are not so distinct as all this, but I cannot forget that at other times I've been deceived in sleep by similar illusions, and attentively considering those cases, I perceive so clearly that there exist no certain marks by which the state of waking can ever be distinguished from sleep, that I feel greatly astonished, and in amazement I almost persuade myself that I am dreaming now. So that sounds like the Inception scenario, right? That the dream is so vivid that I don't know whether I'm dreaming or waking. Am I just dreaming? I've had dreams like this before, where I was dreaming that I was teaching, right? So suppose the dream is so vivid that I'm confused about, I'm no longer sure about whether I'm dreaming that I'm recording a philosophy lecture on epistemology, or that I'm actually giving an epistemology lecture right now. So that's the idea. So we see that kind of scenario in the movie Inception, in the Matrix, and in the Lawnmower Dog version of that Inception idea in Rick and Morty. So I'm going to take this idea, this passage, and I'm going to formulate an argument for skepticism with it using those basic argument forms that we learned in the critical thinking section. And the thing to pick up on is that in this passage, Descartes identifies a potential criteria for knowledge, namely that if we're going to claim to have genuine knowledge, that we got to be able to distinguish waking states from dreaming states, right? And certainly if I want to know whether I'm in the real world or a dream world or a virtual world, I need to be able to distinguish between the virtual and the real in some way. Right? So I'm going to use that as a key premise. So if we have knowledge, and notice the general way in which I'm formulating the argument here is an argument about global skepticism. If we have any knowledge, right, at all, then it must be possible to definitively, notice the way certainty is working there, definitively distinguish waking states from dreaming states. But it's impossible to definitively distinguish between waking states and dreaming states. I mean, if I was having a dream or in a virtual reality so vivid that it could mimic realistic what's real, then there would be no way of telling which is the case. Thus, we do not have any knowledge. And again, notice I'm setting this up as an argument for global skepticism right now, or complete or total skepticism, right? The thesis that we do not possess any knowledge, right? So that forms my conclusion of this argument, right? So one more time, if we have knowledge, then it must be possible to definitively distinguish waking states from dreaming states. It's not possible to definitively distinguish waking states from dreaming states. Thus, we do not have knowledge. That's a modus tollens argument. That's the form of the argument. It's a valid form. So the only question for us is, are the premises true? Does it contain any errors of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction? So there's one argument for skepticism. Right? And again, we're treating this as an argument for complete skepticism, the denial of the possibility of knowledge. Right? So there's one argument that Descartes entertains, but he keeps going. He comes up with this idea of the evil demon hypothesis. And again, this maps over to Rick and Morty, as well as some other things from pop culture movies like The Matrix. Pretty spot on, pretty directly. Fits right in. Right? So here's Descartes on this evil demon hypothesis. He says, yet firmly implanted in my mind is the long-standing opinion that there is an omnipotent God who made me the kind of creature that I am. How do I know that he has not brought it about, that there is no earth, no sky, no extended thing, no shape, no size, no place, while at the same thing ensuring that all things appear to exist just as they do now? So notice that's all extended stuff, that's bodies outside, physical things outside my own head. Right? What is more, just as I consider that other times go astray in cases where they think they have the utmost perfect knowledge, how do I know that God has not brought it about, that I too go wrong every time I add 2 and 3 or count the sides of a square, or in something even simpler, if that is imaginable? So he's moved from doubting things external to his head to doubting his own thoughts, right, about squares and adding mathematical things, right? So now these are abstract ideas as well that he's doubting. So he says, but perhaps God would not have allowed me to be deceived in this way, since he is said to be supremely good. I'll suppose, therefore, that not God who is supremely good in the source of truth, but rather some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. Maybe it's Rick, right? Or maybe it's the aliens in M. Night Shyamalan's episode. Right? I suppose, therefore, that whatever things I see are illusions, right? Or brain parasites in the Total Recall episode, right? So I suppose, therefore, that whatever things I see are illusions. I believe that none of these things in my lying memory represents to have happened did so. I have no senses, body, shape, extension, motion, place, all chimeras, right? What then is true? So again, this is a passage from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and we get a criteria for knowledge here. What if an evil demon was feeding me all of my sensory experiences? How could I know whether that's the case or whether I'm having genuine experiences of the real world? Again, the question is, how do I know it? So again, we can formulate an argument drawing that key point out of that passage. So if we have knowledge, then it must be possible to rule out systematic intentional deception of the senses. Right? So, like, I have to rule out the idea that there's an evil demon that's manipulating me and feeding me my sense experiences, or aliens are feeding me a simulation, right? So if it's not possible to rule out systematic intentional deception of the senses, thus we do not possess knowledge, right? So we've got the dream argument. The reason given for skepticism there is that we can't definitively distinguish between waking states and dreaming states. And in this version of the argument for skepticism, we have the idea that I can't rule out the possibility that my senses are being deceived by some malicious being. Right? Again, maybe I'm in one of Rick's microverses, mini verses, generating energy for him somehow unbeknownst to me. Or maybe Rick is feeding me, manipulating my dreams so that I'll do something for him. Or maybe brain parasites like in Total Recall are feeding me my sensory experiences, right? So 2 arguments for skepticism there. So we set up these arguments for skepticism, and Descartes, he continues doubting everything he thinks he can doubt, logically speaking or reasonably, and he finally arrives at something that he thinks he can know for sure. So this is a famous passage out of Descartes' first meditations. He says, well, there possibly is. I know not what being who is possessed at once of the highest and deepest cunning, who is constantly employing all his ingenuity in deceiving me. The evil demon, the aliens, the brain parasites. Doubtless then, I exist since I am deceived. And let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I shall be conscious that I am something. So that it must indeed be maintained, all things being maturely and carefully considered, that this proposition, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, is necessarily true each time it is expressed by me or conceived in my mind. Right? So go back to George and Omar, right? And think about George and Omar and the belief as being true. Do his legs point to it? Is he justified or not? Does it meet those three criteria for propositional knowledge or not? I think the answer there is, for George's account, pretty clearly no, because he could just be being fed virtual legs, right? His experiences, if you were really being manipulated into believing in a dream world or a simulation, your legs would be simulated. Your legs would be virtual legs. You'd be perceiving a simulated leg. So nothing pointing to something inside your experience doesn't seem to be able to tell you whether that experience is the genuine experience or a simulated experience. In other words, the real versus the fake, right? So again, how do we know? So notice what Descartes does here is he says, look, in order for me to be deceived by something, I have to exist. So if I'm a thinking thing, right? If I'm doubting is a form of thinking, right? Then it must be true, and I can know at least one thing, namely that I am a thinking thing, right? Cogito ergo sum. So to think then is to exist. So I can have knowledge at least of my own existence. Again, even if I'm being deceived by a dream world or a simulation, it has to be true that I have to exist in order to be deceived in the first place, right? So cogito ergo sum. I can have knowledge of my own existence, even if I can't rule out the evil demon or distinguish between waking states and dreaming states, right? So think about the two arguments we just looked at, the dream argument and the skeptical and the for skepticism and the evil demon argument for skepticism. Here's the question to consider. How does Descartes' cogito challenge the dream argument and the evil demon argument? Assuming the cogito is correct, right, what premise or premises in the dream argument and evil demon argument are incorrect and why, according to Descartes? So again, some sub-questions to consider to help you work through the answer to that. So according to the cogito, according to Descartes, is it possible for us to definitively distinguish between waking states or dreaming states or rule out the evil demon hypothesis? Explain. Right? According to the cogito, what proposition can we know to be true? Is the cogito best understood as a priori or a posteriori knowledge? Right? Does Descartes know of his own existence because he's perceiving something through the senses, or does he know it another way, like as a result of introspection or pure reason? Descartes is an example of a rationalist, which means that Descartes thought that all genuine knowledge had to be rooted back in innate ideas rather than sense experience of the world. That's the empiricist school of thought. So we're not contrasting rationalism here with irrationalism, but rather rationalism as a school of epistemology with empiricism as a school of epistemology. Empiricism says that all genuine knowledge has to be traceable back to some sense experience of the world. And then what premise or premises of the evil, demon, and dream arguments does the cogito challenge? Right? So you need to identify them. So I'm not asking about obviously Descartes here, the cogito is challenging the conclusion, but to show that the argument is incorrect, we have to challenge the premises and show that there's a false premise in there, that there's a fallacy in there, or a contradiction in there. So what is it that Descartes is what premise or premises does Descartes' cogito challenge? Right? There's the thing you need to think through for this lesson and for the short answer assignments, right? So again, keep in mind what Descartes is claiming about the cogito, right? And whether or not he's also claiming that we can rule out, if we can rule out deception or definitively distinguish waking states and dreaming states, and that'll help you pare down which the premises he's aiming at. All right, so that does it for this little lecture on some basic epistemology. The key things you need to keep in mind for this lecture are that idea of propositional knowledge, the challenge of global skepticism, the two arguments, the cogito, and the distinction between a priori and a posteriori knowledge. All right, so if you have questions about anything we covered in this lecture, be sure to post them in the discussion forum or raise them for discussion in the live session. Y'all have a good day, and I will see y'all in the next lesson.